Welcome to the Writing Gym Podcast. We're here to pump up your writing. And now your host, Andy Brixey, personal trainer at the Writing Gym.
Welcome to the Writing Gym Podcast. It's Andy, personal trainer at the Writing Gym. I'm so excited to introduce you to this week's guest, Sean Prentiss. But first, I'd like to introduce our resident writing coach, the gal who helps you push your writing up to shape in the Writing Gym. She likes green beans more than chocolate. I don't understand why. Maybe she can explain. Welcome back to the Writing Gym Podcast, Annalisa Parent.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. And doesn't everyone like green beans better than chocolate?
Literally no one but you. Just you on that train. I'm excited to introduce you to this week's guest. But first, a word from our sponsor, Date with the Muse, where you can get help starting, finishing, and bringing to publication writing in all genres. Enter the contest to win a free hour-long coaching session with our resident writing coach. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast on how to enter. And now, I would like to introduce you to our resident writing coach, the gal who helps you pump your writing into shape in our Writing Gym. Welcome back to the Writing Gym Podcast, Annalisa Parent. I'm so thrilled to announce this week's guest, environmental writer Sean Prentiss. Sean is the author of Finding Abbey, A Search for Edward Abbey and His Hidden Grave. He is a National Outdoor Book Award winner, a Utah Book Award winner, a New Mexico and Arizona Book Award winner, and a Vermont and Colorado Book Awards finalist. He is also the co-author of Environmental and Nature Writing, a craft guide and anthology, and co-editor of The Far Edges of the Fourth Genre, which focuses on creative nonfiction. We are so excited for him to be here today to talk about his unique writing process. Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, and I'm very excited to give Annalisa all of my green beans in exchange for all of her chocolate.
Got it. You are on. So, Sean, I'll jump right in. I'm curious by nature. It's a good characteristic in a writer. I'm really interested in how your life's passion for the environment became a passion for writing about the environment or including the environment in your writing. How did those two mash together?
Well, they kind of began together in the sense that I was a business major in undergrad, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And what I realized pretty quickly was it had nothing to do with business. So my mom gave me a journal when I was younger, going off to college, and she said, write in this journal. And I wrote the world's worst journal entries. If you ever want to go to sleep at night and you can't sleep, I'll give you my journals and you'll fall asleep. But I just started writing in my journals, and during that same time, I started moving toward working in the environment. I ended up working on a trail crew for a variety of years, and I would just journal about that experience. But working in the environment and writing kind of began at the same time. And then I ended up accidentally going to grad school for my MFA. And then when I have to choose what to write about, for me, it's almost impossible to not write about the world around me because I'm so influenced by place. Where I live right now, I'm on a lake. So as I look right over my computer screen, I see snow coming down the lake. I have a mountain to my right. But then before this, I was living in a city in Michigan, and I was surrounded by houses, cars, people. And for me, I see the world through the lens of how place affects me and how I guess I'm changed by that place. So everything I write about is influenced about home, my home ground.
That's super interesting to me. I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about place as character.
Yeah.
And, it sounds like that's not only your perspective, but it must be a specialty in your writing or something that you're very proficient at. Can you speak a little bit to place as character in a writing piece and how people can expand that in their writing?
Yeah, definitely. And we were thinking about this, my co-author, Joe Wilkins, and I, in our book, Environmental and Nature Writing, because we have a whole chapter just devoted to place as character. I think that's our title. But a couple different things we think about is, one is the psychology of place, and two is the sociology of place. So what I mean by that is, with the sociology of place, it's how a place affects a group of people. So I grew up in a small, rural, agrarian town that had lost almost all of its industry. So most of my classmates were, relatively poor. There's a lot of blue collar jobs. And my family was not involved in blue collar work. My dad owned a car dealership, a used car dealership. But the whole community could not help but be influenced by that blue collar ethos.
Right.
So that's where I grew up out of, and it influenced just about everyone there. And for some of us, it made us get drawn to small towns. And for others, it made us get drawn to, big cities. So I had friends who raced as quickly as they could to New York City, like you, Andy, or, any other variety of city to get us away from that sociology of place. Whereas for me, I went from one little town to another little town, always staying as far away from cities as I could. So that's the sociology, but then you also have the psychology of place, which is how it affects an individual. And again, you have these individuals that respond to place in different ways. So I think about place as how it influences us. That's one of the ways, but then also just, I guess, the way it can set the mood, the tone, the way it can be a part of the action and play with the action or against the action. But to me, place is character. It's as important as any other characters, because if you took this story and set it down in a different place, it's going to be a different story.
I'm super curious about that. Are there certain genres in which it's more important, in your view, to have place as character, and others in which it might be awkward to have place as character? I'm thinking about the difference between maybe literary fiction and romance, for example. I mean, is there a place for place as character in a romance novel? Could that happen?
Well, I guess what I would think about is how many, and I don't read tons of romance novels, but how many are set in, towns or areas that are ugly and boring. Oftentimes we're transported to someplace special, someplace unique, because I would assume the reader would want to go from, their daily lives to some new, bigger, more romantic life. So we were talking about My Colorado Cabin, and I think it's more romantic to have a cabin in the middle of nowhere of Colorado than, say, I don't know, in downtown Montpelier. I love Vermont, I love Montpelier, but if you put that cabin there, then it's just another house in that community.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think
all I can think of when you say that is like Jane Austen. I think of like Pemberley and how it's this iconic, beautiful, romantic place.
Yeah.
Like it's a whole character in Pride and Prejudice in and of itself. So I think that I've never ever thought of that before in writing at all, is using a place as character. But I think that, we get so focused on making sure our characters are so developed, you never think about, well, how is the physical place where they are really affecting the entire storyline? I've never thought of that before. That's so interesting.
That's a really good point. I made a lot of assumptions on the part of our listeners because I think a lot about place as character. So Sean, can you just give us a rundown of what it is that we're talking about here? What is place as character? How do writers use this?
Well, place as character is the exact same as character. And that sounds really stupid to say, but what I mean is, every piece of action takes place somewhere, whether it's in the real world or whether it's on the page. So if we have two characters in conflict with each other, that's got to occur somewhere. And where it occurs influences it. So if we have two people arguing about something or two people falling in love and they're in a desert, that says something about who they are, and it's going to offer a tone to that. Now we're going to take them to an Iowa cornfield, and that's a completely different thing. And then we move them into outer space, and they're in a Mars space station up there. That's a very different thing. So wherever we move the characters, they're going to be affected by that world around them. And so is the reader. The reader is going to envision these characters in that place. So if these characters are arguing on a rainy day, it's going to feel really different than if they're arguing on a bright sunny day on a Caribbean beach. And so I guess to me, place is character, because what a character does is it influences everything else. And it influences how we think, how we behave, how we act. And even if we have a blank stage, if we have a theater production and it's just a chair and a person and everything else is black, that tells us something about how to view this and what to focus on and what not to focus on.
Yeah, that's a really good description and such good advice for writers. One of my favorite pieces to talk about when I talk about place as character is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And Andy, you can jot this down. We'll include the article in the show notes that I wrote about this. But one of the things that he does here is he creates trees as character and as a sense of foreboding. And it's poetry in prose. It's just really beautiful how that place comes to life and personifies the theme, the idea that he's trying to convey. It's amazing. And so when writers do this well, we don't even notice that this has happened, but we've been influenced and impacted by the fact that they did do it. It's a great Jedi mind trick that writers can use, and certainly something fabulous for our listeners to experiment with and think about how they can bring place more prominently into their writing and really let the setting influence the action of the characters.
Yeah, and I think about tension all the time, and what is my place going to say about that tension? How is it going to heighten it? How is it going to contrast it? But I want it to be doing something. So if I'm out in the desert and I'm writing a piece, that feeling of dryness, that heat that the red rock is going to do something to the tension of the piece. And it could put me in more danger. It could put me in a more romantic spot in terms of the beauty of the world around us. It doesn't matter how you use it, but it'll offer some tension to that conflict. And that to me is one of the important things about having place as a character.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that discussion. That wasn't something that I had top of mind to bring up today, but it's such a fabulous piece, and I think that is really helpful advice for the people listening to the podcast. So thank you for that.
That honestly, I've never thought of that before in my own writing, and now I'm just like, of course. I'm thinking about, like, I love reading science fiction fantasy books, and I think about, like, Tolkien, and I think about, J.K. Rowling. I think about, the authors that I read, and the reason that their fantastical stories are so wonderful, and, like, especially with, like, Neil Gaiman, is the creation of this whole place and how that place affects every single one of their characters. And now I just want to go back and read everything again.
and what would fantasy and sci-fi be without place? They'd be nothing,
Excellent. Absolutely. Great point.
I wanted to ask you, Sean, I went through and read about your bio and everything else, and I was really taken with the fact that you've held all these various odd jobs and hiked and traveled the whole world. Was there an exact moment, you talked about your mom giving you the journal and stuff. Was there an exact moment where you're just like, oh, this is the moment that I really want to write about? This is where I want my life to go.
So, and are you talking about a moment when I wanted to write about a specific event, or when I wanted to become a writer?
Become a writer.
Become a writer? It was a slow process. I was such a self-taught writer, which is the world's dumbest idea. Don't ever do that. Make sure you do something like this and get as much coaching as you can, because for the first 10 years of my writing life, I taught myself. And by taught myself, that sounds like I was actually learning something, but I wasn't. I was just writing in my journal and messing up. But on one trip, I was in Mexico in the Copper Canyon region, and I was doing a backpacking trip, and I wrote about that, and I read it to a friend on the trip, and they told me to submit it to a regional magazine. So I did, and they picked it up and sent me a decent paycheck, which was kind of easy and kind of surprising. But that was one of the times when I thought, well, maybe I can write, because it was the first time I tried to put my writing out there. And luckily enough for me, it was an acceptance versus the millions of rejections I've gotten since then. So that was a big time. And then my best friend talked me into applying to grad school. And going to grad school, I truly expected to drop out because I didn't love undergrad. I was not a great student, and I never knew what I cared about. But then sitting in a room with 8 to 12 writers who love talking about writing and books, it was like finding out that you have all these cousins and they're just like you and they're geeks. And I'd never realized I was a geek until that moment. And it was really fun to find a home and a community. And even though I was a terrible writer then, it just made me want to become a better writer.
Yeah, that's something that has come up a lot. Like as Annalisa and I have talked, we've talked about, the importance of, kind of finding your tribe and finding a community where you feel comfortable, sharing your writing, sharing your ideas, and, getting advice and all of that stuff. And I think that that's what, she really is trying to do with the writing gym, is create this community of supportive people that you can learn from and, get training from, and, having me come on as a personal trainer so that, if you're like I am as a writer and you put it off and procrastinate, there's somebody there to be like, hey, how many words have you written today? What are you doing with your life? And, having that accountability, I think that having that community makes such a difference. It's so neat that you found that in grad school. How did your friend convince you to apply?
Well, his wife was in the program. This is the University of Idaho. And what I did when I was living in Durango, Colorado, which would be it was a great town to live in, but I was mostly unemployed most of the time. And so I had tons of time on my hands. So I would write a little bit, I'd read a whole bunch, and then I'd travel, work when I wanted to. But he kept saying, well, you love to read, you love to write. Why don't you go get your MFA? And honestly, I didn't even know what an MFA was. So he had to teach me what that was. I didn't know what an essay was, even though that's what I wrote. He had to teach me about that. I didn't like school, so he had convinced me to go. But I thought, well, it's not like I was doing anything more important at the time. So I said, sure, I'll apply. And I applied to one school, the University of Idaho, and they let me in. And I learned what an essay was. I learned what an MFA was. I learned a whole bunch of craft. But he just talked me into it by, saying that if I read and write for joy, then why not go to school for it? And he was completely right.
Wow. Well, kudos to the best friend.
He's a great best friend.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you say, Sean, because we have the Writing Gym podcast, but we also have the Writing Gym, which is a site where people have a membership, just like a regular gym, except they're working on their writing. So they're going through various modules that do exactly that. It teaches them the skills that they need, depending on genre, what it is that they're up to, like from starting to all the way through publishing and building an author platform, how to use social media to get your book out to the world, all that kind of stuff, which you're right. If you're kind of just searching in the dark, can you learn it? Of course you can, but it might be a little bit harder than if you have somebody sort of showing you the ropes on how to do it.
A lot harder.
Well, and I think it's a common thing with writers, since we tend to be very solitary creatures who, at first, and Stephen King talks about it in writing, like not sharing your writing when you're in the creative process, but sharing in the revising process. And so we tend to just be kind of, shut-ins, and we don't want to share and we don't want to go out into the world, but that's such an important thing. You don't realize that until you found that in your own life, and you're like, oh, of course it's better for me as a writer to, have a coach like Annalisa who I can send a couple paragraphs to and be like, why is this awful? And have that kind of, ability to talk to somebody about it. Of course that makes sense, rather than, hiding in my house and not talking to anyone. Weird how that works out.
I was just talking to my students. I teach at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and I was teaching to some of the students there, and I was talking about a practice called deliberate practice. And it's, so often when I was learning how to write on my own, I just practiced any way I could, but I wasn't really fixing my mistakes. I wasn't learning new ideas. But the idea of deliberate practice, it's a variety of things, but the biggest thing is to work on your weaknesses rather than your strengths. And it sounds like that's so much of what you do there. You know, if you're great with characters, don't work on characters, work on place. If you're great with place and characters, try plot. If plot is good, then try dialogue. And the more you get rid of those weaknesses, the better your writing gets, rather than just focusing on, oh, I'm a great character writer. So, you get it to a certain level. And, if you have these weaknesses down here, your essay or story or poem is just never going to be that good because it's got holes.
Absolutely. And so, Sean, as you're working with the writers at VCFA, what kind of tips do you give them? Say, I come to you and I say, I have a really hard time with characters. Like, what kind of resources or, what kind of activities, where would you point them to get better at a various aspect of writing?
There's a variety of things. One is to read a whole lot and then to imitate. So, this is tried and true, but I would look for a great essay, story, or poem that does exactly what they cannot do. And then my homework assignment for them would be, all right, now write this exact same piece, but from your own perspective. It can be a story, an essay, a poem, doesn't matter. But try to do exactly what they're doing. You'll never be able to do it, but you'll start picking up these skills.
Right.
So that would be one. And the next is the revision process. Write how you normally write, but then think, all right, I'm going to focus on character. And then jot down all those keys to character. I have to see this character. All right, let's put them on the page. I have to hear this character. Let's focus on dialogue. And then we have to make sure it's realistic. Make sure that we're not overwriting the dialogue. Make sure the dialogue's actually doing something. It's either developing the character or it's developing the plot. Then let's see how these characters are in action. Put them into spots that matter. And then think about what scenes are most important, and then dilate those scenes. So stretch them way out so we get the most amount of tension there. And then what scenes aren't, and we can summarize those or gap those scenes and just jump right over them. But for me, it would just be figuring out what their weakness is and then giving them a variety of drills, just like you would. I was a wrestler, just wrestling drills. All right, you stink at this, keep practicing. And you're going to stink in the beginning. I always tell my students, I want you to take risks and fail, because if you don't take risks, and often risks are going to lead you to failure, if you don't take those risks, you're going to be the same writer you came here as. And then I failed and you failed. So I would rather them try new things, fail spectacularly, and then try them again, get a little bit better, try them again, have some success, and just continue to, again, grow and expand.
I love what you're saying about that, because there's an inherent risk in being a writer in that vulnerability, right? If we're going to get better at the things that we're not very good at, we're going to have to try and fail.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that might be hard about that is that there's a time in our life when trying and failing is a very natural part of our lives, right? When we're very young, we fell a whole lot and scraped our knees, and things happen because we tried stuff.
Yeah.
But then we got kind of set in our ways as an adult, or even a late teen if we're learning how to write, and it gets a little more difficult to try and fail, right? That it feels worse somehow. We don't expect that, maybe. So what kind of tips do you give writers to set themselves up into this situation to say, look, you're just going to have to take a risk? And what do you say to them?
Well, if you want to be a successful writer, then you need to take risks. So if you're very comfortable being the writer you are today for the rest of your life, don't take a risk. Stay right where you're at. That's absolutely fine. But if they're going to if they're going to a grad school program, if they're getting their degree in creative writing, then they don't want to just stay the same writer they're at. And the only way you're going to get better is to take a risk. It's the same with playing guitar or playing football or being on the debate team. If you do the same thing every single time, you're never going to get better. And then the other thing is taking a risk is so much fun. You get to be a new writer every day or every week or every month. And each one of my big projects is so completely different from the last. And I learned so much about my own writing by changing it up. And my newest project is taking science and blending it with poetry so that every single poem is science heavy, and trying to figure out a way to hide the science or blend the science in. And I'm learning all sorts of new skills that, I've been writing since I was 20 on some level. I should learn all this by now, you'd think, but there's so much I can learn, so many things.
Well, and that's the fabulous thing about writing, because, it's an art, but it's also a craft.
Yeah.
And so, as Michelangelo said, I am still learning, right? And I think about that frequently, because if Michelangelo was still learning, then there's kind of an excuse for me, right?
Yeah.
But it's exciting too, because there's always a new thing. We can always refresh and maybe get over writer's block because there's a new way to try something like what you're doing with integrating science and poetry. What would happen if we tried to take a romance novel that was really place heavy? What would that look like? Try it out, see what happens.
And if anyone out there is dealing with writer's block, let me know. I have about 6 million ideas. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, well, we'll have to have you on for a special writer's block special.
Thank you, Annalisa, for more of your great writing advice. Annalisa is the resident writing coach in the Writing Gym. She helps all writers start, finish, and bring to publication writing in all genres. And in my opinion, she's the best writing coach in the world. Also, if you loved our Writing Gym podcast, we'd love to have you actually join us in the Writing Gym. You're going to go absolutely crazy for it. You get a workout there to improve your writing. Whether it's plotting or pacing, fiction or memoir, we've got what's right for you. And the bonus is, we will not make you wear a leotard. We even have a personal trainer, me, to help keep you accountable to your writing goals. I won't make you do sit-ups, but I will make you finish your chapter. To see what we're up to this week, go to www.writing-gym.com. Don't forget the dash. Thank you so much for joining us to pump your writing up here on the Writing Gym podcast. Make sure and leave us a fantastic rating if you enjoyed the podcast, so more writers can find the fastest growing podcast on the net. And don't forget to let us know how this interview helped your writing journey in the comments section. Your 5-star rating will help other writers find us. Be sure to check out the show notes and download all the week's takeaways, as well as this week's freebie on how to use place as character and how to get into a deliberate writing practice at www.writing-gym/podcast. Make sure and check out Sean Prentiss again when he returns in a couple of months to talk about overcoming writer's block, something I know we all need help with. And speaking of freebies, don't forget to enter our contest at www.writing-gym/contest to win a free writing coaching session with Annalisa. Who doesn't want that? The secret code this week is George R.R. Martin. Thank you so much, and happy writing.
This has been the Writing Gym Podcast with Andy Brixey and Annalisa Parent. To join the Writing Gym, visit www.writing-gym.com.